Hello and welcome to episode number 207 of the ATPHC Team Podcast with myself and Danai. Hi Danai, how are you?
Good, thank you. Just enjoying the longer days, just looking out of the window now. And it's a lot sunny here in London, which makes such a big difference and feeling a little bit more alive.
And Anna looks miserable as hell looking outside of her window right now.
Oh, just hearing how sunny it is in London. Could either of you just send it my way, please? I'm so fed up of rain.
It's weird that you don't have sun in London, does. You're not that far.
No. Do you know what it is? So exciting news. My house is going on the market. And obviously it's today that it decides to rain when the guy's coming to take photos. So
Of course.
cheers. Cheers, universe, for doing me a solid.
Oh, I love your house from what I've seen of it. But exciting.
It is exciting. It is exciting. And hopefully someone else can have a very pretty little cottage after me.
Yeah. Oh, how exciting. Well, warning for today's podcast, I have raging PMS. So I may show a lot of fierce compassion today. This is what some may call sassy Emilia, and just be ready for it.
Always here for sassy Emilia.
Yeah. I was gonna say you're talking about the weather, and I was gonna because I'm also like due my period. It should be tomorrow, and the weather in London represents PMS right now. It's like it's raining, the sun is coming out for 5 minutes, it's raining, the sun is coming out for like 5 minutes, it's raining. So that's my mood for the week.
Absolute mood. Well, Lisbon for some reason is kind of nocturnal. It's very interesting. So you start to wind down at night, and we've been working in the nights really, so we haven't been up for dinner, and it'll be about 9 o'clock, and shut the laptop, go into my room, and then it's like, that's an interesting sound. It's like mopeds just up and down. And this continues. Like, this is not just a 9 till 10 p.m. The first night we were here, 3:30 in the morning, there was like a 3 or 4 young lads, I guess, I'm assuming they sounded like young lads, just repeatedly going around in circles. And I was like, it's 3:30 in the morning, you little rascals. And apparently here they just like to party all the way through the night, which I do remember those days. But unfortunately, I already have raging PMS. What I do not require is a lack of sleep. And I did my usual, I'm going to take a selfie of myself in front of Zoom today. And as I did that, I looked at myself and I thought, what is that under my eye? That's just an absolute giant bag. And I feel like I've been... So either I've been punched in the eye and I have a bruise, or it's just pure lack of sleep. So I am very grateful to be in Lisbon, but my sassiness, like, I don't know about you guys, but PMS for me doesn't impact my mood as much as it impacts, like, I'm still happy, whatever that means, but like I'm still chill, but it's the irritability for me. Like, that gets me.
Yeah. My tolerance levels. I'm just like, no, go.
Yeah.
Get in the bin.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm the same. It's the tolerance levels that kind of go down, but for me more in a sensitive, I want to cry kind of way. Get really teary.
That's a safer one for those around you. It's not safe at all. Anyway, we move. Okay, let's get cracking on the questions. Danai, do you want to go first?
Yes, so it's a question from Becca's client. I find that when things are going well in life, relationships, family, work, health, I'm reluctant to allow myself to feel too happy or too excited in case something goes wrong. It's almost like I'm waiting for a disaster because things are too smooth. I still enjoy my time in the present, but it's a constant worry at the back of my mind. I recognize this is stupid because I'm worrying about an unknown thing, which is entirely out of my control. Any thoughts or advice on how to stop doing this?
Anna and I
feel like we both laughed when I was like, I know where this is going. I know where this is going. Not to get all Brene, but what is it, foreboding joy? And funny enough, I was having this similar conversation with a client this morning. She's worrying about a weekend away, and we were saying how, like, worrying about it now is like putting yourself through it twice, isn't it? And ultimately, for her, it came down to control. And it's what she found really helpful was keeping in mind that she is only able to control herself, and everything else around her is always going to be changing and unpredictable. But if she can keep calm and keep present, that's when you can fully like enjoy the moment and like be happy where you're at right now, rather than always worrying about what if, what might, because a lot of the time those things don't even happen anyway.
I think it's interesting to link it to like where would that feeling be coming from? Like, why do you think everything is always going to go wrong? Maybe you have some core beliefs or limiting beliefs around that you haven't maybe addressed yet, and that's why you feel like everything is always going to go wrong, and challenging those and checking in with those, like, are they actually true? Another thing I think is managing your expectations of happiness. Like, happiness is not being happy all of the time. Happiness is embracing all the full range of human emotion and practicing gratitude for the moments that we do feel that kind of what we would call kind of classic happiness, right? The joy. And again, Brene talks about this so much, which is why we were kind of laughing. She talks about like the antidote to foreboding joy being gratitude. So in those moments of when things are going quote unquote well, really expressing your gratitude and consistently having this gratitude practice, so that when things do become more challenging, you've got that kind of backup and that safety net, and you're not wasting your joyful moments worrying about the sad times, because then you just never have any joyful moments. She tells the story of this man that she met who was completely in love with his wife, and they'd been together for, let's say, 50 years. And he always said, you know, I was so scared of her dying first. I used to worry all the time that something was going to happen to her, and it took away from my life, because I was so worried. He said, and then she did die suddenly, and I felt such intense grief, and that wasn't made any easier by the fact that I'd worried about her dying all of that time. All it did was take away from the life that I had. And I think that's exactly it. Like, waiting for the other shoe to drop is not going to make the shoe drop in any easier. And we often do it because we think it's going to protect us, because, oh, well, we knew it was going to happen. We knew it wasn't going to last forever. We knew things would be bad. But it doesn't make it any easier. It just makes you feel right. And would you not rather be happy than be right? I would think most of us would anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It is certainly a coping mechanism and a control thing here. But I think it's also important to kind of normalize and say that, you know, most people struggle with that fear of the unknown as well, and kind of foreboding joy. Even in research, like, they say that actually most people struggling sitting with joy, as opposed to actually other uncomfortable feelings, because joy itself can be uncomfortable in its own way. I think just to add there, because gratitude is so powerful. I've worked on this with some clients, and they found just the idea of mindfulness, of actually catching the thought and calling it out as they're about to worry about the future, in that moment of actually just saying, I have a part of, and I notice I have a part of me that is just about to worry about the future. And then that itself can just help you step out of that thought and come back to the present moment, and then kind of using gratitude as well there to really remind yourself of actually what's really making you happy right now.
I like that a lot. I love that idea of the difficulty of sitting with joy. I think that's powerful. And I think if you ask people how comfortable they felt sitting in joy without the fear of losing it, it would be very interesting. I think that's such a nice point. Anna, question.
Does the body fat set point exist? I feel like I keep gaining where my body wants to sit when I don't control as much.
To some degree, settling range does exist, but it's not what people think of, like, you're born with this genetic makeup of you will weigh 72.5 kilos and your body will do everything it can to get back to that point if it deviates from that. That's not what it is. Set point, or settling range, is a range of weight which is probably higher than you think, a sort of more varied range than you think. And it's based on some genetic components. For example, maybe our resting hunger levels. For example, our BMR doesn't really differ that much, but for some people it might be slightly different, maybe with PCOS. Some genetic components, some environmental components, some psychological components. It's all of these things that tie together that create what we call a settling range, which is where you thrive. And that all ties together things like your habits, your exercise, your energy intake, all of these things, much of what determines our settling range, we have some autonomy over and some control over. The reason in this situation why you find that you're gaining weight probably when you're not controlling is because you're trying to control your body at a lower settling range than is what is optimal for you. That's usually what happens. We want our settling ranges because of this internalized thin ideal and weight stigma. We want our settling range to be probably 5 kilos, 10 kilos less than what is optimal for our body. And when we think about settling ranges, it's when we are thriving, it's when we're regulated, it's when we're not preoccupied by food, when we're eating regularly and sufficiently, and we're not, we don't have disordered habits. We have energy for work, we have energy for socializing, we rest well. And when all of these things are combined, that's where our settling range is. And often for a lot of people, it is higher than we want it to be. And so we fight against that with trying to control it. And often that leads to this kind of yo-yo dieting of I'm going to control it and bring it down. And you can technically move your settling range based on all of your habits and things like that. And so for some people, their settling range is slightly higher, but they change their habits and their food choices, etc. And they can kind of push it down a little bit. But realistically, it's within probably 5 kilos for most people in terms of, and it's a healthy weight. I don't know, I use healthy weight kind of loosely, but it is still a healthy weight for your body. It's not like someone's settling range is going to be where their BMI is maybe in the 40s. That's not what a settling range is. Okay. Sometimes I can ignore my gut feelings and instinct in the moment. And when I do, I can see that my actions are coming from a place of fear, scarcity, ego, etc. But there's also something there around having to earn it. Earn rest, joy, fun, good relationships. So if I don't deem it as earned, there's a guilt attached. But then I try to further ignore that guilt and carry on. But that then adds to the guilt, shame, overdo cycle. What are your thoughts?
There's some I feel like there's some conditions of worth in there, maybe that you're not worthy of those things for whatever reason, and ultimately it's gonna come down to challenging those thoughts, those feelings, those limiting beliefs ultimately, because any of those things that you've mentioned, like the joy, the rest, good relationships, that's just kind of part of like flourishing health, right? And why wouldn't you want those things in your life? Why wouldn't you be worthy of those things in your life?
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing I would say about the feeling of guilt is we know when we do something that's relatively unfamiliar and going against to kind of what has kept you perhaps safe all of this time, that the feeling of guilt will come up. It's more about kind of how you essentially sitting with it, learning how to recognize it without identifying with that, and giving yourself a lot of compassion as you're kind of, like Anna is saying, as you're kind of becoming more intentional about doing all of those things, prioritizing your rest, doing things that bring you joy, working towards building healthy relationships, and still staying with the guilt as it's showing up. And the more kind of you give yourself compassion when that is happening, the more that is going to be supporting your self-worth, both because you're acting in line with your values, but also because you're being kinder to yourself in general.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing is not expecting to not feel guilt for a while whilst you're challenging this. And there's a certain element of testing the waters with this sort of stuff, of saying, okay, well, I know that I feel guilty when I rest, but I'm going to do it. And I'm going to, like you said tonight, sit with that guilt. And then maybe I'm just going to rest for 20 minutes rather than like a full day. And I'm just going to notice that. And then I'm going to push myself a little bit more. And you're training it like you would train a muscle, like you would train yourself in mindfulness, of just noticing it and not taking it as a sign not to do something. The problem is we obviously associate guilt with something that we've done something wrong. And so it can be quite a difficult one to train yourself into saying, I'm not doing something wrong here. But a nice idea is to maybe when you do rest, that you use that time to journal. And rather than sitting down with a plan of what you're going to journal, just sit and have your journal there and notice the stories that are coming up. And as the stories come up, write them down and say things like, the story that I'm telling myself is, I should be doing something. Okay, well, why should I be doing something? Because I've got free time and that should be used for something. Okay, but why should that free time be used for something? And really questioning yourself and consistently going down there. Like I might say, because other people are working when I'm not. Okay, why does that matter? Because I want to feel as good as everyone else. Okay, well, why does that matter? Like really just asking yourself over and over again. And it can be quite confronting, but coming back to your values too, of like, well, so if that was me, I would probably ask, like, well, what are your values? Your values are taking care of your health and modeling good, healthful behaviors to your clients. Okay, so me resting is actually in line with my values, so that's okay. So I think having a journal there when you do challenge yourself sometimes, it's a nice way to start working through it, because sometimes when you look back on it, you can't really recognize the stories that you're telling yourself. Often when we look back on our behaviors, I don't know about you guys, but when I look back on behaviors, I'm like, what the hell was I doing? Many a time. But in the moment, that made sense. In the moment, that felt safe and that felt right. So in the moment, you want to try and start to unpack some of that, or at least write it down so that when you're in a different place, you can then unpack it.
Yeah.
Right. Question.
This is a question from Rosalind's client. What happens if I binge overeat on protein-heavy foods?
Nothing physiologically, it's not hugely different. You'll have a slightly higher thermogenic effect of protein versus other macronutrients. Because of the digestion and absorption process, I think you assimilate slightly fewer of those calories, because calories are not all created equal, and actually energy availability of certain foods means that we don't always absorb and digest and assimilate like the same number of calories from every different type of food, for example. Caloric availability, not energy availability, but same thing. Thinking about periods. But realistically, like nothing else is significantly different in that sense. You might find that binging on foods that are higher in protein, it's more difficult to do because they're more satiating than other foods and they're higher volume than other foods. And I think sometimes when you're trying to break the overeating or binge eating cycle, sometimes you can, as you move out of binging, you can find yourself in the overeating kind of way of eating. And I think sometimes whilst you are breaking that habit, it can be useful to have certain foods that allow you to overeat, but are maybe slightly less ultra processed or slightly less highly palatable. So protein foods might be within that, fruit, grapes, things like that. Like partly for your health, but partly because let's not be naive to the fact you don't just snap your fingers and then stop binge eating. There's always a bit of a process, well, almost always a bit of a process with that. But realistically, if you're actively choosing which foods to eat, to binge on, you have probably more control and more awareness around what you're doing than that kind of complete out of body experience. Probably, again, it depends on what foods you've got available, etc. Which is maybe a bit of a good sign for you that you're starting to become more aware in the moment of what choices you're making, which it means you're potentially becoming a bit more mindful, which could be good. But it depends obviously on your start point.
I'm just gonna flip it slightly, and of course completely agree that that can be a sign of progress, but equally I would check in if it's almost but this is okay because it's protein based. I'm not obviously, I don't know the context, I don't know the background, but something to reflect on perhaps.
Yeah, it's such a good point also. Such a good point.
It's me, isn't it? Yes. Can the reason for your disordered eating habits if unresolved, manifest in different ways throughout your life. For example, undereating and over-exercising to overeating and under-exercising.
For sure. For sure. It's not even just food and exercise. It's also alcohol. It's also spending. It's also sex. It's also overworking. And we see this a lot with PT clients that we work with. They restore their relationship with food, but then they find themselves overeating. It's like, okay, that's great that we've worked on your relationship with food, but there's still an underlying dysregulation that's leading you potentially to this overworking cycle. Often a lot of these habits are symptoms of an underlying dysregulation or unmet need or something like that. And once you work on one, it might pop up in another way.
Yeah, I had this chat with a client actually. She's come quite fine healing her relationship with food and stopping the binge eating, which for her was a big part of actually using food as a way to kind of comfort difficult emotions. And then when that was under control, she started to kind of subconsciously always be really busy, always have stuff going on, weekends being packed with plans. And then, of course, it got to a stage where she was really tired and she was feeling exhausted, and other things kind of, she started to neglect other things around self-care. And then, of course, we got really curious and kind of had that realization that it takes time to actually become really safe to experience all range of emotions and to really kind of practice those tools. And it's so complex with the disorder eating, because so many times we see essentially it's kind of that combination of people are trying to over restrict and diet, and at the same time they might be finding themselves overeating for emotional dysregulation, right? And the more we try to diet and the more we overeat, or the more we comfort it. So but yeah, I mean, with so many clients kind of jump from undereating or overeating depending on the situation that it is, but the main thing is at the end of the day they're all kind of serving a similar purpose of how I kind of feel safe, or how I cope with something that makes me feel uncomfortable, or that kind of fear that I'm not good enough.
Okay, how to achieve your goals when you are prone to feeling helpless in areas of your life? Okay, are you gonna go?
No, you go.
Silence. We're mulling. I think sometimes helplessness is an interesting one, and sometimes it comes from we talk about the drama triangle sometimes, Goodman's drama triangle of, you know, within our relationship dynamics, we often fall into one of three roles: persecutor, victim, or rescuer. And sometimes the helpless feelings can come from falling into a little bit of the victim role. And this is not me calling this person a victim. This is me saying that maybe as you grew up, you found that the way to get acceptance and love was through that helplessness of having someone rescue you in some way, or being persecuted in some way. Like, that may have been a dynamic for you. And again, this is not me saying that you are a victim in life at all. It's just how you potentially learned to get that acceptance and that connection, which is obviously just a fundamental human need. And when you can frame it in that way, maybe you can think back and think, oh, I can see maybe where that might have developed, and this is not for everyone. This might or may not fit or ring true for you. But when you can start to make those links, it's like, okay, well, as a child, that might have been the reality, but as an adult, is that the place that I still want to be in? Are there actions that I can take that would maybe move me out of that role? Feeling victimized is a horrible feeling. Feeling helpless is a horrible feeling. But I think challenging that, because as a child, you may well have been helpless. But as an adult, you're not. And especially when you have goals to achieve, they're your goals because you for a reason, because they align with your values, because you really want to achieve them. And no one will ever be able to do it for you. You're the only person that is completely helpful in this situation. And when you look at, okay, well, what's thoughts here and what's fact? Fact is, you are completely helpful, and I know who this person is, and I know how unbelievably competent she is. So you are totally competent and helpful to do this. So I think some of it is about challenging that story and challenging that narrative, and then giving yourself the evidence, which I know that this person is also doing, but consistently giving yourself the evidence, because when you're not giving yourself the evidence, when you're not taking action, it confirms the belief that you're helpless. That may well feel safe to you. And if you think back to what I was saying about connection, it might feel like the safest place for you, for especially if you feel like you're lacking connection or acceptance in your life right now, you might go back to that role that feels safest, that you feel like that's going to get me that. But that doesn't mean necessarily, well, it doesn't mean, especially if you're trying to achieve your goals, that is the right way to do it.
I think thinking of it as stepping into empowerment, and that means meeting yourself with compassion, but also kind of, well, as you were saying at the start, that fierce self-compassion, in that sometimes it is going to have to be more kind of like disciplined. And when you are kind of having those wobbly days where you want to go back to the safety of what potentially kind of the helplessness, that's when you go, no, look, this is, yes, I'm having a challenging day, but this is more important to me.
Yeah, I think the only thing I was thinking as well is sometimes that I think getting stuck in that helplessness sometimes perhaps can be sometimes a little bit of an avoidance strategy as well. If actually stepping into that empowerment could then kind of, you get to a stage where you have to acknowledge certain things that maybe you've experienced, or certain feelings that you have that can be quite painful to face and work through. So a part of us might find it easier to stay stuck in that kind of helplessness or victim mentality. The other thing I was thinking, completely different context here. I think so many clients will resonate with the helplessness feeling, generally speaking, when they come to us, because they've tried so many different diets to kind of lose weight or change their body. And when they come to us, they're like, well, we've tried everything. I feel like a failure. It's a little bit similar, perhaps, to I'm feeling like I'm failing, where I'm a constant failure from kind of having internalized all of those failed attempts and making it mean something so negative about ourselves. And I see that quite a lot with people as well.
Danai, question.
So next question, would be keen on any tips for keeping up focus when life gets really busy, for things like hitting your step goals, fitting in gym, meal preparation. I want to try and be as efficient as possible.
We love a bit of efficiency here.
Right. Obviously, people listening, oh no, people on YouTube will see. But I have a really busy couple of weeks coming up, and I'm looking at this. You guys will laugh, because I don't actually have a journal. Can you see? This is my life for the next 2 weeks, where I am planning out my days just so I know that I am hitting everything that I need to.
Wow.
I know, because shockingly, winging it can feel a bit overwhelming at times. So I am just being quite anal about making sure that I am hitting not only like what I need to do for work, but also making sure that I am planning in my rest, my yoga, those things that are important to me, those habits that support physical health, mental health. So that, for me, when I was feeling really overwhelmed yesterday with the amount of coursework that I have to do over Easter, was, okay, no, you've got this. Let's just kind of think about things logically. And also going through, I think we've talked about this before, like prioritizing what needs to be done each day, what can kind of be done throughout the week, and what's it'd be great if I could get it done over the month type thing.
Yeah, that's my favorite thing to do. Like, I'm just looking at my notes now, and actually it's concerning at how long this note is on my journal. Goes down to the depths of like, in next year I need to do this, but I've got each day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and the things that I have to do at the very top of that list, and I check them off as I go. And then some of them will be at the bottom of the list because I know they're going to go on to the next day, so I'll just copy and paste them. And some of them are down there that are like, okay, that needs to be done in the next 6 months, that type of thing. So having a today, this week, this month 6 months type of thing can be really helpful. And just I quite like notes, because you can just, sometimes you can write stuff that you think, I need to do this in the next few months, and then actually in the next few weeks you realize you don't actually need to do that anymore, so you can just take that off your list, and it's not like this hard copy, well, I've committed to doing this now, so I need to do it. Like it's much more fluid than that. I like to plan quite fluidly, so have certain things that are consistent. And I think sometimes when you're trying to keep non-negotiables in, so maybe it's exercise or, you know, yoga, whatever that is, it's quite helpful to say, well, I'm always going to do yoga regardless between 5:30 and 6 before I have cooked dinner. Like that's going to be my non-negotiable, whatever it is. That can be quite helpful, because then you're quite clear on your boundaries. And I think sometimes imagining that you're holding, like having someone else that you're accountable to, so whether it be your coach or whether it's your partner, where you say, we're going to go for a walk after dinner every night this week together, that's going to be our time. Incorporating some accountability can be really helpful. And I also think maybe lowering the bar, you might not have to, it depends on how busy you actually are, but sometimes just lowering the bar, but making sure that you do something, because sometimes the bar high, what happens is you don't manage to do it, and then you kind of just go into the screw it, I'm not going to do anything mentality. And that's not helpful either. And then you fall into that victim role of like, well, I just don't have time and I can't do anything, so there's no point. When really you do have time to maybe, I don't know, get a microwave meal, or you do have time to go for a walk or walk to work rather than drive, or little things like that. So I think it's, again, practicing that fierce compassion a little bit, but also lowering your expectations, and know that this is just a season. And, you know, most of the time you're doing so much more than that. And there'll be lots of seasons when you do less and lots of seasons when you do more. And that's absolutely okay. Okay.
Do you think the idea of once you start eating sweets, you can't stop type of thing is something that everyone experiences? Is the only way out of this exposure?
It's not what everyone experiences, no. Everyone does, I think probably everyone, there may be some scientific exceptions to this. Everyone does have the physiological response to eating foods high in certain things like fat, sugar, salt, glutamate, protein. I think you get a certain like dopamine, like neurotransmitter response in your brain in response to these foods. That's a physiological thing. That's what happens to, again, everyone, except if there's maybe an issue there with signaling, etc. We see some changes, for example, in people maybe with ADHD, for example, or some people with obesity, some people with binge eating disorder. Some of these reward pathways are slightly different, but that's kind of on a fundamental level. For a lot of people, not everyone, who restrict those foods, they will get the overeating of those foods subsequently later. Not everyone. Some people, for whatever reason, their genetic predisposition, their preferences for food, you know, not everyone loves food. Some people, just don't have that genetic predisposition to disordered eating in some way. Some people won't get that. But realistically, calorie restriction or food restriction will trigger that in most people. But yes, I say exposure therapy because I think exposure therapy sounds kind of extreme, but stopping restricting these foods is realistically the only way to overcome it in an environment where you're never going to not be exposed to these foods for the rest of your life. So realistically, yes, that is the only way to move through it.
Yeah, well, we usually advise clients, right, to focus more on kind of approaching their nutrition from a much more kind of place of inclusion. What can I add to my diet to make it more nourishing, as opposed to focusing on what you have to cut out or reduce, essentially, because of course, if you focus on adding more vegetables, more protein, more fiber, more whole grains to your diet, naturally you'll feel more satisfied, you'll experience less cravings, you'll therefore find it easier to control yourself around those foods as well.
Hey, Ross's question. How do you know if you are overeating without tracking? I have tracked for 12 years. I'm currently eating regular protein-rich meals and snacks to prevent binging, but I cannot for the life of me work out what the difference is between enough to be satisfied and too much.
Ros will be supporting you in kind of identifying the various levels of hunger. I mean, you're probably familiar with like the over fullness, uncomfortably full type feeling, but what Ros can support you with is finding that sweet spot with fullness. And from what I'm hearing in that question, it's more so maybe the perception on how much you should be eating rather than actually overeating at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was thinking that too, because often when we track because we want to be on a deficit, which means anything that often when we track because we want to be in a deficit, meaning that when we stop tracking and perhaps not being in a deficit anymore, anything can feel like overeating when perhaps you're actually eating an amount that your body needs. I think also Emilia kind of said something that was very helpful earlier, though, that when you kind of recover from binge eating, sorry, it's normal to go through a phase of overeating as well, and sometimes that's also needed, especially if there was a kind of heavy period of restriction, and you kind of your brain really need to trust you essentially that you are going to honor your satiety. You're going to have a meal until you feel satisfied. You're not going to feel overly hungry and all of those things. And it does take time to build that trust with your internal cues, and that's okay. And like Anna said, Rosalind will be helping you kind of get more in tune with your hunger and fullness cues, and then it'll be much easier to know kind of what your sweet spot is when you're eating a meal, to know when to stop when you feel satisfied.
I think a couple of things too to add on, like ultimately you'll know if you're overeating regularly because you'll gain weight. And it doesn't matter if you slightly overeat or undereat in one meal in general. And I'm going to say why this is not necessarily specific to you yet, but in general, it doesn't matter if you overeat slightly more in one meal, slightly less on another. Over time, if you overeat, you will gain weight over time, or lose weight if you're undereating, or roughly maintain if you're eating at maintenance. However, for somebody who's trying to overcome binge eating, or to overcome binge eating, you may not be weighing yourself. You are also eating to not binge as opposed to eating to hunger and fullness right now. When you're overcoming binge eating or hypothalamic amenorrhea, there are certain situations as well where eating intuitively is not the goal. Eating regularly and sufficiently is the goal to stop yourself from binge eating and or to regain your period, etc. So that may not be specific to you right now. The other thing is it's not just trust in your internal cues that you need to build, it's also your ability to actually hear your internal cues. And what I mean by that is, what I know Ross will 100% be doing with you if you're not doing it yet, is somatics work and soothing work and regulation work ultimately to help regulate your nervous system, because when you're dysregulated, certain parts of your brain become activated, and these parts of your brain are responsible for what we call interoception, which includes hunger and fullness. So if you're constantly on high alert, or you're constantly feeling anxious, or potentially hypo-aroused, apathetic, and experience depression, these parts of your brain are not necessarily able to notice your hunger and fullness properly, and eating intuitively in those times it won't work. We all know that person who gets anxious and doesn't really get hungry, doesn't really want to eat, and other people who get stressed and want to eat loads and snack all the time, because we're dysregulated, and these parts of our brain are just not able to recognize hunger and fullness properly too. So a lot of people, when you start the work on overcoming binge eating or disordered eating, is a lot of people that I work with and we all work with begin in quite a dysregulated state, chronically dysregulated, chronically overworking, overdoing, never taking rest, feeling guilty and stressed about the fact that they binge eat, and then restricting and putting ourselves under more physiological stress. And it's this cycle. And actually trying to honor your hunger and fullness at that point is it's very unlikely going to be successful. So again, that's one reason why we work on the regular eating side of things first, the regulation side of things first. And then as you become more regulated, and less likely to feel like, more likely to be in touch with your hunger and your fullness, then we can start looking at more honoring that hunger and fullness once you've got through that phase. Danai, question.
So Yes, also so Steph's client now. I'm currently taking athletic greens, basically multivitamin. I initially started taking it because I was pretty sure I didn't get enough vitamins through my diet. Now, since I've been eating fruits, veg, protein with every meal, wondering if a multivitamin or any supplement still makes sense beyond the recommended creatine and vitamin D.
Stop taking them. And I say this because Em and I had a discussion on EIQ Live last night, and she told me how much they cost.
Yeah.
Holy moly, it's something like £70 a month or something.
Yeah, crazy.
Absolutely ludicrous. Stop taking them. You don't need them. You have an incredible abundant diet. It's just you're pissing your money away. Spend it on more fruits and vegetables, or on getting your nails done or your hair done, on something that's more wholesome and satisfying than a greens powder. That's what I say.
Yeah, I have nothing nothing to add.
Spot
on. So I've combined two questions together because they're on the same kind of wavelength. Is it true that a plant-based diet with no meat is worse for mental health? And what foods are best for cognition?
Okay, so I think this comes from the idea of the idea that certain amino acids are within meat and they are responsible for an increase in, for example, serotonin production. I think that's where that comes from. No, it's not true. And realistically, I'm actually talking about this at Level Up. If you're a coach or PT, make sure you're coming to Level Up in the middle of April, because I'm actually talking about this myth around diet and mental health. People now are saying, oh, we'll improve your gut health because your gut health is attached to your brain via the gut-brain axis, and if you improve your gut health, then you improve your mental health. There is no research that's robust that says changing your diet will change your mental health or your mental illness in some way. There was a big study called the SMILES trial that did some work on like Mediterranean style dietary patterns, which does include meat and fish, but it's mostly plant-based. But there were some fundamental flaws in that research, which it was a great research paper, great trial, but there were some issues with it in terms of making conclusions about, they were looking at people with depression, and it was a 12-week study, and they gave some people a Mediterranean style dietary pattern, and then they had a control group, which was like a befriending trial, which was basically like where they had social support groups, and then they looked at changes in depression. Anyway, that's the style trial that's most frequently cited for these types of things. There's no trial that's kind of compared meat consumption in a randomized controlled trial, i.e. where we give people something and then look at the outcome. There's no research that says like giving people meat versus giving them a vegetarian diet has a difference in terms of mental health outcomes. Do I think that means that there's absolutely no association between what we eat and our mental health? Absolutely not. But mechanistically, the reason that people are saying this meat thing is the mechanistic link of serotonin. But it doesn't translate into what we know from the research.
Mm-hmm.
What was the second part of that question, or did that answered?
What foods are best for cognition?
Oh, caffeine and a diet rich in all the macronutrients. Realistically, some people will say keto because of the impact of like fat on fuel use for your brain, but again, there's no research. But what is interesting is anecdote. Like I find anecdotal stuff really interesting, and we know, for example, that the keto diet is helpful for children with epilepsy. Very specific situation here. But anecdotally, some people will say, you know, I feel like I've got this mental clarity when I'm on a keto diet or something, and it's like, good for you. Like if that helps, and I've got friends who have chronic pain and say that like keto, for example, is really helpful for that. And I think, you know, there's no research for that, and I would never recommend that stuff. But anecdotally, if you feel like only eating eggs and bacon in the morning, I wouldn't even say that. It's not because bacon is quote unquote unhealthy in terms of like realistically, if we're looking at foods that we want to minimize, it's going to be things like processed meats, etc. Right? So I wouldn't really say that, but I am a big proponent of like, you know what, if you feel your best and you're getting all the range of nutrients that you need, then you do that. But no, there's no just make sure you've got enough energy.
Yeah, it makes me laugh. My dad started having like tomato on his toast every morning because he'd read in, I think it was my mum's magazine, like Good Housekeeping or something, that a tomato a day helps to prevent Alzheimer's. And I was like, this man had a PhD in physics. So I was like, really? Like, are we going to have that conversation? Do you want to look into research? And obviously found nothing that was like, yeah, that's it. But after like years of doing it, it's like, well, I just like it now. So
And you know what, like, you got to weigh up of like, is it adding something to your diet? Tomato, for sure. Feeling empowered in the morning that you're taking control of your health, for sure, then you go right ahead. But yeah, you could probably find a Daily Mail article probably for literally any food and like mental health outcomes, or not mental health outcomes, but health outcomes in some way.
That's literally what I was thinking, because that question is plant-based diets with no meat, and then you have the other people saying, oh, you have to follow a carnivore diet for improved health and mental health and all of these things, and people go crazy like, okay, what do we believe?
I mean, just never believe this reductionist, right? Ludicrous. Okay, me. Okay. I've no boundaries at all in any relationship, whether it be friends, family, whatever, and that's definitely affected my disordered eating when I'm constantly being let down. Next behavior goal. Oh, sorry, checking. So, hold on. I think we're just going to leave it with that. Okay, so it's not really a question, but I've no boundaries at all in any relationship, whether it be friends, family, and I think that's definitely affected my disordered eating when I'm constantly being let down. What would you do in that situation?
Oh, I mean, that's a great link, right? In that lack of boundaries affects the way in which you eat. But I don't know who this client is working with, but you've come to Emilia for support, meaning that you are in a place where you're ready to make change. And so now you're going to have to do something a little bit different and prove to yourself that you are kind of worthy of putting in those boundaries in place to help to improve your relationship with food, because you've already taken that first step. So this would be the next kind of step for that, it sounds like.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's like you've already proven to yourself you can do incredible hard things. I mean, you've come so far, and you have this amazing awareness to actually know that the lack of boundaries is linked to your disordered eating. And similarly, I think there was a similar question earlier where we were talking about someone that was struggling with rest. It's a little bit like slowly now starting with something that feels quite doable, like an area in your life where you don't feel as afraid to start to set some boundaries. It could be really small. For example, I'm just trying to think of something really, really simple. So I'll use an example from a client recently that came up for her. So she would always say yes to her kids for kind of giving them a lift to certain places, even though she was really, really busy with other things. So started really, really small by saying no when she knew the bus was just about to come. So she would tell her daughter to take the bus instead. So, and then of course we started to do that with something a little bit more scary, and then kind of so on. So I think, yeah, starting with something really small essentially is key here. And then the more you kind of get to experience the benefits and how good it feels when you show up for yourself in that way, the more you want to do it.
Completely agree. And I think also this kind of ties into what I was saying earlier about that drama triangle, right? Of the role that you play. And sometimes if you are maybe more in the helper fixer role, you put everyone else first and you don't have boundaries. And one, none of us can relate to that whatsoever. And two, I'm just wondering if not setting boundaries feels safer to you. Because again, if you're in the helper role, that's how you got love, or that's how you feel you got love, connection, acceptance. And so setting boundaries is like, oh, that might move me out of that place of always helping other people and always putting other people first. That's a scary thing to do, because if you do that, well, are people still going to love and accept you in the same way? So maybe I just won't do it. And I think everyone feels that to some degree when they're setting boundaries anyway. But if you do find yourself maybe identifying more within that space, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to challenge that because I don't need to fall into that narrative to be loved and accepted. And that's trickier than setting a boundary. But sometimes we have to do these things to break ourselves out of that identity, as opposed to waiting to break out of that identity to then do these things. It's like when you're developing self-worth, sometimes you have to treat yourself I like you are worthy, even though you don't feel it, in order for you then to eventually feel worthy. And one of my clients she's just a legend, and she was like, I was waiting until I'd lost some weight before I got my hair done and my Botox and all these things. She's like, I was waiting until I felt good enough to do these things. And it's like, no, like you deserve to do all of these things now, because those are things that are important to you. And you have to sometimes act in a way that you don't necessarily feel in that moment.
I'm just thinking also with the fact that it is impacting your disordered eating, like what are you looking for from meeting those friends, and obviously being let down with your lack of boundaries? Like, is there a way that you can meet that need aside from just being around those people? Like if it's connection, are you getting connection in other areas of life, doing other things? Something to consider, perhaps.
That's a great point, especially, yeah, I think that's a great point. Okay, let's do one last question. Danai, go for it.
Georgia's client. So I'm trying to achieve more of a balance in my life. Georgia has given me the task of writing down 10 activities that I enjoy, which I'm working on at the moment. My question is, what brings you joy? Interested to know what yours do to ensure good balance in life.
Lovely question. I travel. I like right now I'm in Lisbon. I'm still working the same as I would always work, but I find being in new environments really stimulating for my creativity, and I find new environments motivating, and just to be able to walk in a little bit of sunshine brings me joy. So I prioritize, if I can, putting my money there and traveling. And I'm here with one of my best friends, and so connection for me is everything. And she's also working every hour under the sun, and she's actually kind of nocturnal with her work, so we don't even get that much time together, but the little moments of connection, they bring me joy. Getting out of the house, going for a real coffee in a coffee shop brings me joy, rather than just saying, I'll just have one at home. Like little things for me, like connection, coffee, decaf, sunshine, like those are the things that probably bring me joy. Treating myself to a takeaway pizza every week genuinely brings me joy. Shutting the curtains and turning my phone off brings me joy. The moments of silence in the morning when I'm about to do my meditation, where I've still got my phone on airplane mode and I sit in the semi-dark but awake, and I think it's all quiet, and I have 15 minutes of just breathing, that genuinely brings me joy. Those are my things, I think.
I resonate with so many, so I don't know where to kind of say. I don't want to, because I'll say, oh, the same. But yeah, I think especially for me, what I realize even more now that I solely work from home, and I have a lot of clients actually saying that they only work from home, is how much you appreciate real connection, regardless of where you get it. Even what you said, Emilia, just going to the coffee shop and actually having a proper interaction with someone. So I'm being really intentional now about kind of socializing with friends, which brings me lots of joy. Spending time with my partner. Nature is a massive one for me, especially living in London. I think kind of being proactive about perhaps having a little bit of a day trip somewhere in the country side. I recently went to Cotswolds for the first time, and I felt like a different person, which makes me think, is London the right place for me to live? But food for thought for me for the future. And the sunshine. So I'm going back home to Greece in a couple of weeks. So I'm looking forward to getting loads of vitamin D.
Yeah, completely agree with a lot of those. And I think for me, I include my animals because they bring so much joy, and I think they teach us a lot of things as well. And I can say this because she can go back to my brother at the end of the day, but my niece, and watching her like learn and grow and explore and just find herself is brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Oh, yes. Do you know what I got a lot of joy over recently? Because it's Easter. I was putting an Easter bag together for my nieces, an Easter bag, and I was like going around the shops putting in like Easter masks that they can colour in and all this stuff. And I was like, this is utter joy. And then the joy that you can get just from colouring an Easter mask and my nieces is like, gosh, what a dream. What a dream. How lucky we are to have siblings that have babies for us.
I know, yeah. Like, I don't want one, but you are great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for your questions. Thank you both so much. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.